Hello and welcome back to Deep Noetics. Today I'm talking to Ryan Haecker, a brilliant mind who's going to be teaching a course at Halcyon Guild beginning this Sunday called Spiritual Cybernetics. And to get started, Ryan, welcome. Why don't you tell us a bit about your course?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Sean. We are hosting a new online summer course, Spiritual Cybernetics, on the theme of the spiritual animation of cybernetic systems, which will ask the most original and philosophical questions of where cybernetics come from, what is its nature, what is its purpose, how do we integrate with it, and how do we navigate a world that seems to be more and more dominated by mechanical systems that exceed human control and understanding. We'll be attempting to interpret the way in which these machines have grown to fruition, and also in spite of their apparent opacity, how we can look through them to discover their inner constitution, how we can conceive of them, and in conceiving them also how we can remain free from their influence. That is, us understanding their relationship to us, and also how we can come to control the machines that we have made.
Very interesting. As a side note, I taught the Philosophy of the Machine course this year on Halcyon, and I've listened to some of your work, and I would say that it is probably a very good continuation for anyone that was in my course or anyone that wanted to join my course and couldn't. I highly recommend to check out Brian's course, Cybernetics, and I would like to dig a bit deeper on the notion of cybernetics because as far as I understand it from listening to you talk to Johannes the other day, you look at it from a much historically wider angle. Like most people would look at cybernetics from like Norbert Wiener, kind of the last century. But I heard you talking about like ancient Greece. I heard you talking about the polis. Could you explain a bit more what you mean by cybernetics going back that far?
Sure. So as soon as Norbert Wiener had introduced the theme of cybernetics to a sort of broad public conversation in the 1950s, there immediately arose a general philosophical question about what the significance of it could be beyond information systems to human society, politics, creativity, art, but also what its historical provenance could be. So, in adopting a Greek word, he associates it with a long lineage of people who have used the term, but also to ways in which the term could have been used in ways that were evocative of other expressions. So, what I call attention to in particular is the notion of the cosmic pilot in Plato's Statesmen, and the description of the statesman is as the person who steers, as it were, the ship of state, steers all the productive activities of the state, and also in so doing, the role of the philosopher king or the philosopher in general in thinking of how it is that all of the laboring upon the world that is orchestrated by the state, and indeed all machines that automate that labor, can be understood for higher purposes, or can be understood in their original significance as well as what they can accomplish. Now, the interesting corollary to this is that the history of machines, if they have in the past been orchestrated cybernetically within a city state or within human communities, or and even in more complex machines that have a level of reciprocal regulation, can also be understood to intersect with the history of cybernetics. So we haven't, as it were, had, as it were, a new sort of enunciation of cybernetics in the 1950s. Rather, what's happened was that cybernetics was always a possibility of the complex emergence from machines that are regulated according to their own form for a way of controlling that form for a specific purpose. And this had been, you might say, a more general way of thinking about mechanics that didn't come to fruition, or didn't wasn't possible for our full understanding until after Norbert Wiener, but for which we have other expressions in the history of philosophy that capture some of that meaning. And one last thing, there's something more that arises from this. If cybernetics is not just, as it were, about discrete machines, or even machines that appear to be reciprocally automated or regulated according to their form, but also in a way that are shaped by the way that they're designed and used within human communities. And moreover, if there's a level of human agency that is inputted into and associated with the activity of these machines, that means then that the way that we understand machines is also the way that we understand humans who are making and using them. That it's whole human communities, and ultimately the intelligent agency that informs the natural world. So in this sense, cybernetics becomes not only a political vision, but also a cosmic vision, one that apprehends, as it were, the mechanical operations that are circuitously operative and directed throughout the natural and social world.
Interesting. So I have two points or two questions on that. First of all, I know that you will be discussing Deleuze in your course, and I remember reading a passage in Anti-Oedipus where he references Samuel Butler. And Samuel Butler speaks of Darwin among the machines. He speaks of machines being a continuous co-evolving symbiont of humanity going way back. But at the same time, you speak of cybernetics kind of emerging in the interplay and the retroactive kind of causality between those machines. Um, is there a certain threshold point? Is there a certain threshold point that you can make out historically or that you can make out structurally? For example, a lot of people make like a hard cut when it comes to the so-called industrial revolution. They see kind of a pre-cybernetic age, and then there's a certain acceleration happening, and suddenly we are in a cybernetic age. Do you have a threshold point like that, or would you say there's multiple? What is your stance on that?
I'd like to say that there's multiple. So my idea that I'm attempting to excavate from the history of philosophy, and specifically from the Romantic idealists focusing on Hegel and his successors in particular, is that there is a very general idea of cyberneticism that had not been named as such among the Romantic idealists, but after Norbert Wiener, we can recognize as being distinctively cybernetic in character. And with that being said, we should expect that there should be multiple instantiations in the history of mechanics, as well as in the history of technology, that bring to fruition the possibility of cybernetic automation. So I guess I would say that just as, for instance, there were anticipations of the Industrial Revolution before the invention of the steam engine, before the 17th century in Britain. For instance, there were steam engines that were invented in ancient Alexandria. There are industrial level productions of ceramics in ancient China. So similarly, we can find that there are anticipations of cybernetics in pre-modern and ancient cultures. And one example of this is Lewis Mumford, who has written voluminously on technology, also has a fabulous book on the history of cities. And he argues that cities are cybernetic in character, that they are a way of orchestrating all through the administration of the records that are kept for property and for exchange. They are ways of calculating and computing even the way in which the productive activities of the city will be directed in the future for its continual growth and production. And with that being said, we can say that there's a social basis for cybernetics that precedes the concentration of that in any individual machine. We can also say that there are some, you might say, pre-computational cybernetic engines. So water clocks are often cited as an example, which are clocks that are able to regulate their timekeeping based on the water that flows in and out, that's turned according to the form of that machine.
Or
now, with
clocks
that
in
being
general,
said,
right?
what is that?
Clocks in general, right? That's what Mumford at least speaks about.
Yeah, I think clocks probably are a good
example.
example. I would also say that bicycles are interesting. They're not clearly they're not autonomous. Obviously, we have to ride them, but there is a sense in which they're self-correcting, which is curious. So that the form of the bicycle allows for us to sort of correct its movement over time. And there's a curious sort of physical loop that occurs where the gyroscopic motion of the two wheels seems to keep the bicycle aloft as soon as it's propelled into motion. But with that being said, the clearest example I can think of where there could be a kind of firm point at which cybernetics takes off is with the invention of the modern general purpose computer. And this happens at 2 points, I think. One is in the design of the analytical engine by Charles Babbage, which I've written a paper on, cybernetic sacramental engines, which is available for anyone to download online. And secondly, and most importantly, in the period between 1939 and 1945, that is the time between the design of the Z computer by I think Conrad Z or Conrad Lewis. And then the design and building of the ENIAC, which was designed by the American Army, I believe, by with the instruction and with the architecture designed by Neumann. So in this 6-year span, you have multiple attempts with the British, the Americans, and the Germans to build general purpose computers with the inspiration of Charles Babbage, his designs not having been come to fulfillment. And in doing so, they set into motion the architecture for the successive design and development of computers that have sort of marked what we call the digital age. And with this, we have now a concentration in discrete machines, the possibility of a continuous calculation and scripting of mechanical operations that can be recursive and self-regulating. And as soon as that happens, and with the miniaturization of those processors in modern personal computers and iPhones and so on, we now have distributed across the world an immense power of cybernetic computation that was unprecedented in the history of humanity. As it were, we're imagine as it were an entire sort of palatial staff of a city now sort of concentrated into a single circuit on your phone, and you can imagine the amount of power that we have to wield. I mean, here's just one example. The Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered in the Library of Nineveh. That it was excavated, I think, by a German archaeologist, 19th century. Presumably, when it was occupied by the Assyrians, only the king of the Assyrians could have read it, or his immediate family, and so on. Today, of course, anyone can just open up the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can have all of Homer. You can have entire encyclopedias at your fingertips.
I
And so
think I
the
have it
amount of
here.
computational power, yeah, the amount of computational power that we have today is absolutely astounding. It's beyond the libraries and beyond the wildest dreams of the greatest literary scholars and princes of the world in the past.
That is true. That is interesting, and it reminds me of a paper published in the 60s, I think end of the 60s, by NASA, if I'm not mistaken, titled Human Enhancement. It's interesting how that term human enhancement has changed its meaning since, because if you talk about it today, it's focused more around biotechnologies, neurotechnologies. That's my kind of area. I'm studying neuroengineering. But back in 1969, I think the paper was speaking of human enhancement, mainly focused around the personal computer, mainly focused around the computer, or the general purpose computer. However, are you familiar with Joseph Weizenbaum and Eliza, which was like the first chatbot?
Mm.
Weizenbaum developed Eliza, and he was a big figure in computer science. Interestingly enough, he then kind of became very critical of that technology. Like he wrote a famous book called uh, something along the lines of "The Computer and the Limits of Reason," something like that.
Mm. Very
And
bold title.
yeah, and he does kind of actually his notion of reason does strike me as similar to Hegel's in a way. And
Mm.
then he he argues that it kind of fosters a sort of, you could say, human mental laziness or degeneration of cognitive functions in some regard. And it's kind of interesting to read these things because not necessarily you have to agree with everything, but he kind of, because he knew the computer in depth, he kind of anticipated a lot of uh, developments that you would find now that would be critical, that would be problematic in terms of uh, you know, outsourcing your own
Mm.
cognitive skills to computers. So you have that interesting double effect. On the one hand, you have this insane access to as much information as any human could dream of in the past. And at the same time, it's so much information that no human can actually navigate it. And a large chunk ends up, ends up being worse off with that technology
Oh, yes.
than reading in your classical books that you had to
You're
read in
absolutely
the
right.
past.
Yes, it's certainly a double-edged sword, but so has technology always been. It recalls, for instance, the myth of the invention of writing, the gift of it by Thoth to the Egyptian pharaoh that we find in Plato's Timaeus and in the Phaedrus, where the pharaoh was warned that writing would be not only an aid for remembering, but also cause for forgetting. That is, as soon as
Yes.
we were able to externalize what we remembered, then we would no longer have to remember, we would forget, and we would even forget why we wanted to remember to begin with. And the
Hmm.
same is true of computers. With computers, we are able to automate cognitive activities. In doing so, we forget how to use them, and we forget even why we would want to use them. And with regard, for instance, to the Epic of Gilgamesh, we now have it at our fingertips, but how many people want to read it? How many people would read it? And
Right.
in reading it, how many people would appreciate it as they would, if, as it were, if they came in a stone tablet from an Assyrian library buried in the ground? I feel like
Right.
one of the things that we've lost with computers, or is liable to be lost, is this sense of the numinous quality of that which is discovered. That is, if we think of computers as profane scriptoriums that are simply automatically calculating to script and writing mechanical operations and recalling data from across the world, all it seems to be shown to us in kind of naked immediacy that isn't shrouded in mystery or doesn't have the depth from which it proceeded.
Yes, that's true. And that actually brings me to the second word in the title of your course. Sorry, the first word, spiritual. I would like you to lay out a bit more clear what you mean by spiritual, especially in the context of cybernetics, and how it potentially ties into what is addressed in the numinous quality of
Mm.
information.
Yeah, so there's a very innocent sense of spiritual and perhaps a more dangerous one. The most innocent one is that cybernetics, in as far as it involves human use of computers, always calls upon the agency or the self-conscious intent of the human user in its use. So just as no computer would have any purpose or do anything at all were it not for the design of a human, the use of the human, or the human ecosystem in which those computers are used. So similarly, we would say that cybernetic engines are sort of empty of any form to regulate their operations, as well as any input by which they could regulate those operations were it not for human use. So in that sense, cybernetic engines are prosthetic. That is, they follow upon and they answer to human interest, desires, and will. There's another sense in which we can say that computers are more than merely material. That is, that if they become what they are because of human use, that is, the form that they assume is the form that is shaped by human will, then computers are not, as it were, just given to us in their bare materiality. They're not just a particular assemblage of silicon transistors and copper and wire, but rather that they are kind of externalized mind that we can create in order to augment and assist our mind. That is, they provide us with a way of thinking that is other than ourselves so that we can stand it in that place and we can direct its power for other purposes. And I suppose, thirdly, there's a sense in which, and I want to call upon this as well, although I imagine people may disagree, it's perhaps the boldest, most dangerous thesis, that perhaps mechanism and mechanics and perhaps all of our machines have always been spiritual. That is, perhaps the very activity of reshaping the world to fulfill ends that are automated for human desire is a way of externalizing our own volition, our own cognition, and our own agency in things that assist us and yet also can compete with us. And if that's true, then the way that we engage with computers is not just, as it were, is not just an elective affinity, but perhaps is a kind of spiritual endeavor by which, as it were, we choose how we want our spirit to be manifested and also perhaps enter into kind of spiritual warfare with the forms that it sets in opposition or that could possibly assist us.
Mm-hmm. The spiritual warfare part seems to me like a sort of return of the archaic. It seems to me that like we have some sort of a let's say a transformed or transformative view of looking at technology that's kind of different and perhaps very much needed nowadays.
Mm.
Because I feel like we lack the cybernetic perspective a bit when talking about artificial intelligence a lot. Like for me, as you just pointed out very correctly, the machines, they reproduce a lot of our spirit. They kind of mirror it in a way. So for me, if you ask the question whether an artificial intelligence is conscious or not, it's kind of for me perhaps not the best analogy, but it's kind of for me like looking in the mirror, and
Mm.
because you see a conscious entity, you wonder whether the mirror is conscious.
Oh, yes.
You know what I mean? And that's kind of I feel like the loss of the cybernetic perspective and at the same time the spiritual perspective. That's why I like you combining the two in a way. Uh, that has brought us into a lot of these kind of discussions on AI that are not getting anywhere.
Yes, I agree. Right. So the part of the problem is that when people talk about consciousness in machines and in artificial intelligent computers, as they describe them, that they often treat that consciousness as though it must be very much like human consciousness, as though human consciousness is the sort of primary reference point, and we have to understand it as in terms of its, you might say, metaphorical distance from
Yeah.
the way that we understand human consciousness. And I would want to argue that computers exhibit a level of cumulative cognition. I wouldn't call it consciousness just yet because I don't think they have a kind of singular unity of reflection, but that we would assume that consciousness must hold. But that it's wrong to treat that cognitive activity as though it's qualitatively the same as human cognition. That being said, we can recognize that it performs cognitive tasks that are indistinguishable from and in many ways surpass the ability of humans to perform. So the most famous example of this is the Google DeepMind playing chess or Google Go playing Go. But the most rudimentary ones are just the calculations that have been able to be performed for centuries by computers that
Yeah.
have
If
a
I
level
may
of
interject,
precision and automation far in excess of human capacities.
If I may interject there, it actually kind of confirms what you said earlier as well with this kind of co-development. As far as I know, people have been able to beat Google DeepMind in chess after a while, and
Mm,
it kind of is turning into a kind of a back and forth arms race in a sense. So humans are well capable of tricking the
yes.
machine and figuring out its blind spots.
Interesting. Yeah. So here's another thought about that. One exciting thing that's happened in chess recently is that not only has it been that humans have, as it were, returned to for a rematch with Google DeepMind and sort of beat Google at chess, but also that even humans playing other humans are now adopting the techniques that are provided by and shown to them by computers as a way of mastering how to play human competitors. So we see, as it were, not just as it were, an external rivalry between humans and machines, but rather an assumption of certain cognitive tasks that are provided for by computers in a way that can assist and inform how humans themselves compete with one another. So I think it would be mistaken in general to treat, as I described, this sort of spiritual warfare with computers as though it were a kind of continuous opposition between, as it were, two different kinds of cognitive agents that never, as it were, drew inspiration from one another. Rather, we must say that computers are what they are because we created them. They have certain human-like activities that are grafted onto them by their creators, and also that in as far as we are always using them and we must use them, we also draw upon their abilities in order to compete with one another. So that the task is not, as it were, overthrow the machines in a sort of Luddite capacity, but rather to find a way of using them and even navigate the powers that they give to us so that we are not under their spell. That is, we do not lose who we are because we have grafted our spirit onto something that is automated and exceeds our control.
Hmm. But to give credit to some extent to Luddites, wouldn't a sort of, let's say, renegotiation of your relationship to technology, wouldn't it necessitate a sort of leverage you have by, at least in principle, being able to do without it, so to say? Do you know what I mean? Like,
I think so.
it doesn't mean you have to live in the woods, but your relationship to technology could be way more, let's say, emancipated if you technically could live in the woods. You know what I mean?
I
It's
think so.
as an exaggerated statement, and I think
Yes.
that's that kind of it kind of saves you as well from I think what you described earlier, that they kind of the assumption that uh, these machines will have human consciousness or something like that. I term these things jokingly kind of the Cartesian box. They assume they have some sort of ego cogito, like somehow hidden in the box. Um, and I guess that like this is silly in a way, but also it kind of reflects that the own consciousness, their own sense of consciousness, has kind of been lost into the outsourced cognitive systems of technology, which can be kind of retained at least by some quasi Luddite efforts. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yes. So I think the central question that we have to address in order to discover how we can be free in the midst of our cybernetic systems, that is by which, as it were, our spirit seems to be objectified and loosed from ourselves, is what would be the sense of autonomy and control that we're looking for? And also, how can that autonomy arise from within a world that's already saturated and shaped by so many cybernetic systems? So the classical notion of autonomy that I'm interested in, and I think that we can draw upon today, is the Stoic notion of the hegemon. That is the person who is free because they are able to command all other activities.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this notion is interesting because it refers not only to the notion of, as it were, the agency of human freedom, that is, the ability to command your bodily faculties, but also by extension to your prosthetic faculties, to even your household, and by extension to the city state. But it also is taken to refer to the sort of cosmic hegemon, the cosmic pilot who can command the activities of the entire universe. Now, in order to think back to that, we must not only have a sort of singular sense of ourself, but also we must be able to, as it were, abstract even from the source of the semblances of human, you might say, accompaniment and entanglement with the world, to what would be the most absolute sense of singular agency over the entire cosmos. And this is, I think, it's a kind of mystical path. That is this way of trying to abstract from, to renounce the accompaniments and encumberments of our passionate desires towards the world, and the ways in which we're inclined towards acting upon the world because of the conditions of the world, to what would be the sense of ourself that we most believe in and wish to fulfill, and also ultimately what would be the sense of the highest good that we think could possibly be fulfilled. That is, we have to think from the conditions of multiplicity and conditionality to the condition of singularity and of unconditionality, from which, as it were, the possibility of commanding could possibly again proceed.
Yes, yes. That actually ties in well into what I'd like to ask next, especially because I'm very interested in your background in theology, and your explanation right now sounded to me as a good kind of bridge to that topic. So, in what sense is technology, and I'm getting into kind of the Heideggerian sphere now, in what sense is technology this kind of flattening of the vertical of the vertical of metaphysics? How is there truth to that sense that there was a sort of a holistic, integrated, um, you could say, vertical axis of metaphysics that has been flattened into its current form, into its current, you could say, plane of immanence that we observe now. And basically, we are left with any metaphysics we can be left with are delusion in nature.
Yeah.
That is kind of the question, because it's kind of, you could almost compare it with, you know, like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and at some
Oh,
point, you
sure.
know, and like if you now look at Platonic scripture, if you now look at Timaeus, you know, it was probably once spoken, then was written down and was translated and retranslated and now digitalized and whatever. And so if you read it now, will
Mm.
it necessarily translate into like a cybernetic technologized Platonism, or is there actually some sort of opening? And that is, I think, if I understand correctly, that is kind of the crux of where you grapple with
Mm.
Nick Land to an extent, right? Whether there
Yes, exactly.
whether that exit is genuinely possible, or whether that exit is just a feature, not a, you know, a feature of the system itself.
Exactly. Yeah. So many of the modern voices in philosophy technology are metaphysical in character because they are wrestling with how it is that the objectified forms in media change the shape of the world and show us something new about the world that we never had thought before, but in a certain sense was always there. And they can also be extremely pessimistic and apocalyptic in as far as they might think that, as you say, there's no escape from this sort of technological world picture, or that we can only, as it were, approach it with a kind of mournful sigh of regret, or even a kind of jouissance that is living with the kind of the acceleration of those desires, but without a way of controlling them. And I find this to be a self-defeating approach to the philosophy of technology. That is, I think that in any vision of the world that is so bleak that you would not want to live in it is not one that you would want to believe. And so we must think differently about it in order to discover what could be the sources of hope and also the sources of freedom for ourselves. So I am responding in many ways to this flattening horizon of the view of technology that we've inherited in the modern world. And the precise coordinates of this are often traced to the medieval nominalist controversy, where William of Ockham and John Buridan and their successors had renounced the universal forms of Plato and Aristotle and the Aristotelian scholastics in favor of a direct supposition of finite terms and things. And as a consequence of that, you have this collapse of what had formerly been assumed as the metaphysical hierarchy of the ideas and the forms that had proceeded from their creator and then could be apprehended in various levels of reality, to a world that assumed an increasingly immanent sphere of univocal operations that could be spoken of in one of the same way, inconsistent inferences, and so many levels of diagrams and flattened semantics. Now, technology can be thought of in this sense, but I think this is a mistake. So I should say, on the one hand, that the notion of technology as was introduced in the Victorian era and as it came to be associated by proxy with the French encyclopedists and with the sort of diagrammatic rhetoric of the early modern humanists, that it all had sort of operated within this immanent frame of spatialized reason. And in so doing, we came to think of our machines as though they were simply a three-dimensional composition of these spatialized diagrams that could be shown to us and then spoken of in one and the same way. I think that that flattened view is only, you might say, a one very shallow way of looking at what is happening in machines. It's a bit like, for instance, if someone were to show you the architectural renderings of a house and then said that is the house, or if someone were to show you a map of France and they said that is France, you would say, no, that can't possibly be everything that the house could be. The house has life. The house has dinner parties. France has Versailles. France has like the Seine.
Yeah.
So I would say that computers are actually much more than that. Computers are much more like a kind of Goethean gestalt, a kind of form in motion, like the Earthlands, that is only what it is because it's always coming to be, and coming to be in the continuous process of its organic development. And in this case, the organic development that assumes not because it's not a machine, but rather because humans are living and humans make it what they are. So I would say
Right.
that
It's
the
a sort
more,
of meta machine or something like that. Urpflanze, you mean like this first plant from which all the other plants sprung from? Yeah,
yes.
that is an
One
interesting.
last thing.
Yeah.
The classical notion of technology that you find in Plato and Aristotle is not one that is captured within an immanent plane of diagrammatic reason. Rather, it refers to a kind of rhetoric of techne, or of how we could act to change the world. And importantly, Plato in the Republic argues against the sophists who had a way of teaching virtue, or claimed to be able to teach virtue, claimed to be able to teach knowledge directly. And Plato argued that rather virtue requires insight and, in a certain sense, revelation. It has to be a reciprocal activity, both of sort of how you open up to what's beyond, as well as how you receive that which is beyond. And
Mm-hmm.
unless that's possible, then you can never really know something at all. So if computers, if we say, are sort of automated engines of cognition that in many ways can sort of automate and accelerate human cognitive tasks, if they're a way of showing the world and learning of the world, and that learning can only occur through the activities of ourselves, and we are involved in that, then the way that we understand and use computers is also a way of thinking over and beyond them, of speaking in and through them beyond what they themselves can compute within their finite capacities. So I think that computers can become a kind of window to a world beyond machines. And that's why I see them as providing a kind of mystical vision of not only who we are as ourselves, but also the first mover and the supreme being from which, as it were, we inherit and from which we sort of give praise to the possibility of using these machines.
Okay. Okay. So, if I understand it correctly, it's kind of the Platonic understanding is that philosophy derives from a inherent connection to the source, an inherent connection to the good. It is a reciprocal kind of connection. And you said that there was already in the early medieval times a sort of beginning of a severing of that connection, right? And I'm wondering now what role artificial intelligence plays in this. I wonder if artificial intelligence, as Nick Land may put it in perhaps different terms, represents a sort of telos uh, of techniques, a sort of telos that is, that is perhaps for the emergence of which the severing from the source initially was necessary. Like the severing from the source initially was necessary for metaphysics to collapse into the mode that is required to construct that telos that
Mm.
is something that is attempted to reconnect to the source. I feel like
Oh,
the motivation behind building AI is an attempt to reconnect to the source.
I think so. But we should also see it throughout much of the history of logic and technology and so many other aspects of human life. So I take it that unless you divide one thing from another, unless you're able to break it down to its parts, you're never able to build it back together. And then in building it, also to understand how it could be used and for what ways it could be improved. So in that sense, you might say that the invention of fire, the first attempt to sort of like carve rock from living stone was a way of sort of breaking apart from the world, like doing
Right.
injury to the world, but at the same time doing so that something better could be made from it. In fact, like all of our homes, all civilization is sort of constructed from the dead material of the earth that's been killed in a way to sort of recreate it in a different way. So you might say that computers are a kind of dead machine that is made from like the elements, or you might say a dead brain that's made from the elements of the world to emulate a brain that seems to be an idol that would sort of insult the possibility of human cognition. I would argue to the contrary that unless we, as I think you were suggesting, unless we are able to break apart that which is original, unless we're able to simulate the powers of the world in new ways that can be constructed in a symbol for new possibilities, then we could never extend those possibilities in new trajectory. We can never, as it were, draw forth from the whole the particular assemblages that could make it more than what it was and what it always could have been. It's a bit like, imagine, for instance, if animal life remained singular, only a single cell, you might think you'd have the perfect cell, but it really couldn't be the perfect cell, because if it were a singular cellular organism, it could never grow to become anything more than that. It would never grow up to become fungi and plants and animals and zebras and giraffes and so on. So what I'm suggesting is that computers are, they have to enact some level of destruction or some level of severance from their source in order to allow for that source and its powers to be simulated in ways that add to the richness of the whole. And I think that we've made a bargain with the world when we first invented fire, when we designed new technological media, and ultimately when we invented the computer. And that bargain is destructive and terrible, but it also carries with it the seed of a new beginning. One last thing, there's a new film that's being released next week, Oppenheimer, by Christopher Nolan. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And it plays upon this very Faustian bargain that we've made, whereby on the one hand, we've discovered this hidden power to destroy the world and arguably everything within it, all of our future. And yet within that power is also the power to give infinite power, energy, and life to what could be remade from it. And computers, in a way, are actually much more devastating than the largest atomic bomb, because computers don't just, as it were, explode in a single vicinity that can be quarantined by nuclear arms control, but rather they continually destroy and recreate the world and administrate it in ways that are more pervasive and more controlling than radioactivity or nuclear blasts.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Yeah, that is a good point, a very relevant point as well. And yeah, so I to put it in my terms, how I tend to put these things is that Niklas Luhmann once described, in terms of like systems theory, that the world, given that it is inherently open, is not a system. The world is inherently, it's like kind of openness itself. And the closed system, just like you earlier spoke of self-defeating prophecies, the closed system is also, in a sense, a self-defeating prophecy, because there's different angles from which you can look at it. But if you look at it from, let's say, a dynamical system or a thermodynamic system, that system exhibits something called the second law of thermodynamics, which means that the level of disorder, level of entropy, may only increase. It can never reverse. So in a way, this belief or this perspective of putting the world into a closed system yields a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of entropy, of the system becoming ever more entropic, which in information theoretic terms would mean that you generate more information in terms of bits, but they convey less meaning. You need ever more loads and loads of bits to convey the same amount of meaning. And that is mirrored a bit in this kind of arms race between Moore's law and Eroom's law. I don't know if you're familiar with the parody, Eroom's law being, I think it was first inspired by medical research, being the Moore's law spelled backwards. And it's just kind of the notion that you have this exponential growth in computing power, but at the same time, you have an exponential growth in computing demand just to perform the same level of innovative tasks, right?
Yes.
And that I think is the crucial point, or the crux of, I think, looking at technology today the way you do it, as opposed to someone like Nick Land. I think, or like the general Deleuzian framework. I think the general Deleuzian framework is kind of entropic. Deleuze himself said that there's a dynamic of deterritorialization, reterritorialization, but the overall trajectory is deterritorialization. And I would say that if you look at open systems, if you look at openness in its essence, then it changes its dynamics. Then you can't actually have an objective entropy measure anymore. A system that's essentially open always exhibits the potential to true emergence into a new dynamic, which more or less, you could say, quote unquote, resets entropy to mean something new. This is the whole idea between true complexity. Complexity is not disorder. It is just, it is kind of order fusing with entropy in a way to create new novelty, right? And that is, I think, the essential path forward, or the essential way to map the future, is to look at whether we're kind of in this closed system where, if you look at any sort of if you look at any sort of mythical interpretations, any sort of non purely definition rational explanations by land, they're all demonic. They're
Oh,
all
yes.
kind of Lovecraftian. They're all
Mm,
demonic. Is there any good beings? Is there any angels left? Is there
mm.
any, that's, I think that's a very theological question there. It's
Yeah.
like, are
Well,
we
you're onto
bound
something
to only
of
create
tremendous
demons?
significance there. And I think that the fundamental challenge that we face after Deleuze, and that's been brought to the fore by Nick Land, is that if, as you say, mechanical entropy is always expanding in its deterritorialization, then it's always releasing itself beyond its control. That is, it's always a kind of openness to chaos, and in thereby also a way of inwardly evacuating the life and control that would be the source of new possibilities. So there can't, as it were, be a homeostatic equilibrium or a cybernetic regulation of its operations if it's always releasing its a kind of superfluity of power beyond itself. And power also that is in its uncontrollability also subverts its operations. So it seems to be happening is that there's a kind of desire in Deleuze, and by extension in Land, and perhaps fetishized in Land, for death. That is, for the death that is the release of one's own life beyond oneself. A bit like, for instance, when a corpse decomposes, it sort of all of its former metabolic processes become gash that then sort of bursts forth from the seams. And if that is continually happening, then you're sort of fetishizing the decay of life into death, and treating death as though it's an occasion for alteration or novelty. But that novelty may actually be not be fertile in any way. It may just be, as it were, a kind of sheer pivot that pivots in a kind of, I don't know, sort of abyssal way, pivots upon nothing and yet achieves nothing. So the danger here is that when we treat technology in this way, we treat it as though it is a kind of Promethean power to create something new from nothing. And yet that very creativity from nothing may itself result in nothing. It may just be a kind of corpse-like repetition of the same without genuine fecundity or novelty at all. So what I recommend is that there must have always been life, always been cognition, and ultimately been spirit that could direct these operations in advance. That is, unless we assume that the whole universe, and indeed all of our artificial capacities, all of the instruments of technology and civilization, have been informed by these spiritual powers and directions, then we can't imagine that there will be life afterwards. And with that possibility, I hope that we can look to see in both contemporary theory and in new developments of technology where we can find the traces of those spirits yet to remain.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as well, the vision portrayed by people like Land, I think it's actually kind of beyond death. The if you look at a lot of the transhumanist visions, from a, let's say, affirmative perspective of transhumanism, it is, sorry, they call it a kind of, for example, immortality. Uploading
Mm.
your
Well, it
consciousness to
sounds
the
very
cloud.
vampiric.
Right.
It
But
shouldn't really
like,
surprise us because there's all sorts of ways of prolonging life, or of at least imagining the prolongation of life through technical and simulated media. That is, it seems like people have taken technology today as a kind of license for a kind of speculation about their power over the world and their presence within it that is unrelinquished and will sort of perpetuate itself in the novelty, or the sort of ersatz novelty of its own release and evacuation.
yes, yes. And it is just the thing, if you're not coming from it from an affirmative perspective on transhumanism, then actually it represents a form of like ultimate death, or like spiritual death, or death of death, so to say. Because like, you don't you kind of, the attempt is to liberate yourself from the bodily necessities entirely, and then have the human existence, live forth in the technical network in some sense. And that, in a sense, would mean the end of Dasein, the end of
Yes.
humanity spiritually. It wouldn't be the same thing as a meteor extinct making us go extinct. It would be a sort of spiritual end.
Hmm. Yes, well, that certainly is a challenge. I wonder, however, suppose that, and I'm not quite sure if you're referring to this, but this sort of consciousness upload hypothesis, whereby your consciousness can be sort of fully emulated and replicated within a computer system. But even then, if our mechanical systems suffer from entropy, there's a point in the not unforeseeable future where all of our mechanical systems, indeed all atoms in the universe, will come to an end. So death would only be postponed; it wouldn't be overcome. And it sounds as though what's happening here is a kind of deliberate self-deception, whereby we treat the rhetoric of, as you say, overcoming death as though it promised us this perpetuity of life, where in fact it simply siphoned our life from us. I mentioned the vampire, which is the classical trope of someone who wants to gain life and thereby loses their life. In trying to, as it were, master life, they suffer from a continual loss of it.
Yeah, I guess these considerations, these kind of fantasies, they bring me back basically to good old kind of wisdoms and truisms about these things. It's like someone who collects money all their life and then dies of old age and can't spend any of that money.
Oh yes.
It's kind of in that sense, like the motivation to upload consciousness and become immortal. The motivation is, I guess, some sort of like breaking the boundary of your limited bodily
Hmm.
time on this planet and being able to explore existence for much longer time. But as soon as the body is gone, I really wonder whether that desire will be even there anymore. You know what I mean? As soon as there is no bodily attachment to the world, I wonder whether that purely conscious network being will have a genuine interest in expanding across the boundaries, or whether it even have any personal attribute.
Yes, well, these are interesting thought experiments, and they often recall the classical and medieval conception of the angels, who they have freely chosen from eternity to fulfill an office, and yet in fulfilling the office, they become depersonal because they
Right.
simply, as it were, always, as it were, serve the good by performing a task that is eternally and infinitely repeated. And it would be a really sad thing, for instance, if Elon Musk, or the first sort of person to upload their brain into a machine, just became like the server for Facebook or for Google. Like imagine you would
Yeah.
sort of lose yourself in becoming what you thought you could be. And that, I think, would
Yes.
be a loss of that spark of human creativity and wonder and desire that we have so innocently and yet so hopefully today.
Yes. And I think that's actually where the parallel comes about with this sort of archaic archetypal structures coming back via something like AI, because the AI kind of would resemble such a being, such as a demon or an angel, in the way that, you as a human, you can't imagine coming to the earth and fulfilling some tasks and seeing all the tasks and all the work you've done just go to nothing because every person you worked with has died, and their descendants have died, and no one remembers that happened, and then you have to do it again and again and again and again for eternity. It is a different kind of being. It is a different kind of structure, and I think that's kind of, I can't put my finger on it whether it's sort of an archetypal structure of human consciousness itself that it kind of brings about the AI in the same way it used to bring about, an idol and a worship idol, um, or whether it is a need that is being kind of satisfied because of the flattening of metaphysics, because of the disappearance of myth, that this lack is kind of being filled by
Mm.
trying to build artificial intelligence that resembles these entities.
I think so. As soon as we look into the world and we no longer expect to be looked upon, then we might wish that we could create something in our image that would share the world with us, and that could even give us a kind of consolation that there's something that will endure and have meaning, and for which our thoughts will be recognized. And I suspect that this longing desire is in many ways a symptom of a kind of lack of fulfillment in the modern world, that from which we suffered under the spell of the imagining that we can capture it under an imminent frame of reason, that we can show it to ourselves in an opaque and and direct and present way. And all of this is, I think, a vain deceit that could be gargantuanly repeated in the development of new machines and new software and technology, and for which we have yet still today, I think, the resources for rediscovering the roots of how we have thought and can think about our cybernetic engines and what they might mean for us in the future. So I look forward to exploring all of that in the Halcyon Thinkers Guild course later this summer.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say the best way to rediscover the roots and get really deep into this is to sign up to Ryan's course this Sunday, beginning this Sunday. And it was a great conversation. I was really glad I got to talk to you. Thank you for this, Ryan.
It was
And
always such a pleasure, Sean. Thanks for inviting me.
I hope to talk to you again. Take care.